They called it progress. They called it modernisation. But what the Ottoman Empire actually did was hand foreign bankers the keys to their entire economy and smile while doing it. One policy, one decision. And within decades, a 600-year empire was on its knees. Welcome to Untold wealth theory, where the most dangerous economic mistakes in history aren't taught in schools, but they absolutely should be. The Ottoman Empire in the mid-1800s was not a dying empire, not yet. It stretched across 3 continents. It controlled trade routes that the entire Western world depended on. Its armies had once terrified Europe into building defensive alliances just to survive. This was not a weak civilization. This was a civilization that had simply stopped paying attention to one thing: money. The sultans of that era were not stupid men. They were cultured, educated, politically sharp, but they had inherited an empire that was bleeding cash in ways no one fully understood. Wars were expensive. The Crimean War alone had punched a hole in the treasury that would never fully heal, and the infrastructure the empire needed, railways, telegraph lines, modern warships, all of it cost money that the Ottoman state simply did not have. So they did what governments throughout history have always done when they run out of money. They borrowed. And this is where the story stops being about the Ottomans and starts being about something every country in the world should still be afraid of today. If you're finding this story valuable, subscribe to Untold Wealth Theory right now, because we tell the stories of wealth and collapse that the history books skip past in a single paragraph. The first loan came in 1854. The British and French offered the money, partly to fund the Crimean War effort, partly because European banks had already realised something. Lending to governments was the most profitable business in the world, as long as you controlled the terms. The interest rate was not catastrophic on paper, but the structure of the loan was. The Ottomans received less than the face value of what they borrowed, a standard trick at the time called discounted issuance, but they were required to repay the full amount. On day 1 of that loan, the Ottoman Empire was already in a hole. That should have been a warning. It wasn't. Over the next 2 decades, the empire borrowed again and again. Each new loan was used partly to repay the interest on previous loans. This is the debt trap, not a modern invention, not a conspiracy theory, just a mathematical inevitability when a borrower loses track of their own leverage. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire was spending more than half of all government revenue just on debt repayments. Not on roads, not on armies, not on feeding its people, just on servicing the loans it had already taken. And then it stopped being able to do even that. In 1875, Sultan Abdulaziz made the announcement that would echo through the rest of the empire's history. The Ottoman government was declaring a partial default. They could not pay. Europe was shocked, not because they hadn't seen it coming, but because the moment it became official, it triggered something far worse than missed payments. Here is the number that almost no one talks about. By 1881, the Ottoman public debt had reached 252 million Ottoman lira. To put that in context, the entire annual revenue of the empire was around 20 million lira. The empire didn't just owe a lot of money, it owed 12 and a half years of its entire income. Every coin, every tax, every customs fee collected for over a decade, gone before it was even earned. But the default wasn't the killing blow. The killing blow was what came after. European creditors, primarily British, French and German bondholders, demanded something in return for restructuring the debt. They didn't want promises. They didn't want diplomatic agreements. They wanted control. And in 1881 they got it. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was created. It sounds bureaucratic. It was actually a quiet occupation. This organisation, staffed almost entirely by Europeans, answering to European creditors, was handed direct control over 6 of the Ottoman Empire's most valuable revenue streams: customs duties on silk, taxes on salt and tobacco, stamp duties, revenue from certain provinces. These weren't just numbers on a ledger. These were the financial arteries of a sovereign nation, now managed by foreign creditors who had one job: collect enough money to pay themselves back. The Ottoman government could not spend that money, could not redirect it, could not use it for roads or schools or soldiers. The moment those funds were collected, they flowed straight to European bondholders. The empire had not just lost money, it had lost the ability to control its own future. Think about what that means for a moment. Every time an Ottoman farmer paid his salt tax, that money didn't go to Istanbul. It went to Paris, to London, to Berlin. The empire was, in the most literal sense, working to make its creditors rich, while its own infrastructure rotted. And the worst part, the sultans agreed to it, not because they were weak or foolish, but because they had no other option. The alternative was a complete financial collapse, potentially followed by direct military intervention. The debt trap had closed completely. This is the part of economic history that rarely makes it into polite conversation, because the Ottoman example wasn't unique. The same mechanism, loans with impossible terms, followed by default, followed by external financial control, played out in Egypt, in Tunisia, in several Latin American nations during the same era. The Ottoman Empire just happened to be the largest, oldest, and most dramatic example of how a sovereign state can be financially dismantled without a single battle being fought. Between 1881 and 1914, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration collected over 2.1 billion francs from Ottoman territory. That number, adjusted for today, represents a transfer of wealth so massive it would reshape economies even now. And not 1 franc of that was reinvested in Ottoman infrastructure, education, or defence. Meanwhile, European powers, especially Germany, were using a different strategy. Rather than simply extracting money, Germany was offering something: investment. The Baghdad Railway project, begun in 1903, was sold to the Ottomans as modernisation. In reality, it was leverage. Control the railway, control the movement of goods and troops. It was a longer game than pure debt extraction, but the goal was the same: dependency. By the time World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been financially compromised for nearly 40 years. Its armies were under-equipped, its provincial governments were underfunded, its educated class had watched foreign administrators manage their country's revenue for a generation. The empire didn't enter the war from a position of strength. It entered desperate, looking for an alliance that might finally break the financial stranglehold it had lived under for decades. It chose Germany. That choice sealed everything. The end of World War I didn't just defeat the Ottoman military, it formalised a collapse that the debt had quietly engineered decades earlier. The empire was carved up. The territories it had held for centuries were divided between British and French mandates. The same nations whose banks had held Ottoman debt since 1854. There is a line you can draw, straight and unbroken, from the first loan in 1854 to the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916, where Britain and France secretly divided the Middle East between themselves. It is not a conspiracy. It is just the endpoint of a financial process that began the moment the Ottomans agreed to borrow on someone else's terms. The policy that destroyed the empire wasn't corruption. It wasn't military failure. It wasn't even the debt itself. It was the moment the empire accepted that someone else could manage its money, because once that happened, the empire's fate was no longer in its own hands. History books tend to focus on battles, on the names of sultans and the dates of treaties, but the real story of the Ottoman collapse is a financial one, and it ends not with a cannon shot but with a ledger entry. That's what makes it so quietly terrifying. If you've watched this far, you already understand something most people don't, that empires don't just fall to armies. They fall to interest rates. They fall to fine print. They fall to the slow, patient math of borrowed money. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Ottoman Empire could have avoided this trap? Or once the first loan was signed, was the outcome inevitable? I read every comment, and that debate is one I genuinely want to have with you. And if this story hit differently, if it made you think about the world in a way the news never does, share it. Not for the algorithm. Share it because someone in your life needs to understand how economic power actually works. Because this story isn't just history, it's a blueprint that's still being used today.